Once a man sees the gap, the danger is no longer ignorance, it's relief. Previous episode closed the awareness exit. You weren't aware, you were fighting. Awareness became the hiding place. Because there's a version of this that's even more uncomfortable than not knowing. And it's this: you knew, you felt the pressure, you made a decision, and then quietly, reasonably, with very good justification, you walked it back. If you're listening to this hoping I'll make reversion sound reasonable, wrong episode. Your reasons already do that for you. This one doesn't explain it, it names it. This episode isn't about whether you fell off, it's about what reversion actually is. Not failure, not weakness, not a bad month, a choice. Dressed so well in circumstance that you stopped being able to see the scene. This is Iron Suits, where strength wears a crown. I am Marwan. There was a week, you know the one, something shifted in that bathroom, or the photograph, or just a morning where you felt the gap more clearly than usual, and you moved differently for a few days. You trained, you made decisions at the table that were different. You said no to something you'd normally have said yes to. You chose the earlier morning. You skipped the thing you usually have at the client dinner. Small things nobody noticed, but you did. And it felt like, finally, like something had clicked back into alignment. Like the version of yourself you know you're capable of had shown up and decided to stay. That feeling is real. What happened next is what this episode is about. Then a deal got complicated, or the flight was at 5 a.m. and you landed already running, or there was a dinner you couldn't move and the morning you couldn't protect. One exception. And the exception felt reasonable. Because it was reasonable. That's a mechanism right here. The first exception is always reasonable. Always. That's not a coincidence. That's how the system protects itself. It waits for a moment when the exception is genuinely justified, and then it takes it. This week has been different. A reset Monday. Monday came and you mostly reset. Not completely, but mostly. I mostly felt fine. Though that word has cost you more than you think. Because the previous week was the benchmark now. Not the standard you set, the adjusted version. And that's how it works. Not a collapse, a recalibration. So gradual it doesn't feel like movement. So quiet that by the time you notice, a new floor has been in place for weeks. And here's what mostly looks like from the inside. It looks like management. It looks like a man who had a difficult period, maintained what he could, and is now back on track. The language is intact. The intention is intact. The identity is intact. Only the standard moved. And because it moved slowly, because each individual step was reasonable, there's no single moment you can point to. No decision you would call a decision, just a series of adjustments that added up to a different place. Here's the doctrine line for this episode. Relief became the standard. You just didn't announce it. Hold that. Because everything that follows is evidence of it. Let me give you the shape of what actually happened. Not the story you've been running, the mechanics underneath it. You saw the gap in the previous episode. Bathroom mirror, the photograph, a small adjustment. You felt the pressure of not knowing, or rather, you felt the pressure of knowing. And pressure, real pressure, demands resolution. So you found one. Not by closing the gap, by discharging the pressure. The exception discharged it. The reasonable explanation discharged it. The mostly reset discharged it. And once the pressure was gone, the urgency went with it. That's not weakness. That's not lack of discipline. That's how intelligent men manage discomfort they haven't fully committed to closing. They find the exit that doesn't look like an exit, the exit that feels like a reasonable pause, the exit that still leaves room for Monday, back to the week after the decision. Back to the week after the decision, because I want to stay in that specific window. You're on a flight early, the kind of early where the airport's half empty and the lights are still on their overnight setting. You're running on a few hours. The deal is already in your head before you've taken your seat. You had the plan for the morning before the airport. It didn't happen. Not dramatically. You just run out of time, which is true, which is always true. And somewhere over the first hour of that flight, while you're going over the deck, all the numbers, all the call you need to make when you land, the plan stopped existing. Not consciously. It just dissolved into the background of everything else that was louder and more immediate. And what replaced it wasn't a decision, it was relief. At least I have to think about that today. That's a moment, not the exception, not the missed morning, the real relief that followed it. That quiet settling, that small internal release when something demanding gets moved off the list. That's where it lives. It's just as, excuse me, it's just this week. The structure isn't gone. I just need the right conditions. Here's the part that doesn't get said out loud. The right conditions never arrive. Not because your life is unmanageable. Your life is extremely well managed. Because the right conditions are a moving target and the relief mechanism keeps pushing forward. When the deal closes, after the quarter, once the team settles, when travel drops off, every one of those is a real thing. Every one of them is also a function of a man who has decided, without saying it, that the standard applies when it's convenient. And as a standard that applies when it's convenient is not a standard, it's a preference. You know the difference. You apply it everywhere else without being reminded. The question is why you keep forgetting to apply it here. And the answer is that you haven't forgotten, you've exempted it. Let's name the system because it has one. Signal. Something fires, a waistband, the mirror, a comment that lands differently than you expected. The photograph you close without looking too long. Pressure. The gap is visible again. Exception. One reasonable deviation. The flight, the dinner, the deal week. Real, legitimate, accepted. Relief. The pressure discharges. Not because the gap closed, because you stopped looking directly at it. Recalibration. The exception becomes a new floor. quietly, without announcement, without a meeting, without a decision you'd be able to point to later. Repeat. That's not circumstance, that's decision architecture. And you've been running it long enough that it feels like weather. Something that happens to you rather than something you keep choosing. One careful, reasonable, entirely justified step at a time. I'm not reverting, I'm just in a heavy period. Here's the state of mouth that holds this whole system together. Reversion in your mind looks like collapse. It looks like a man who gave up, lost control, stopped caring, let everything fall apart. And since you haven't done any of those things, the word doesn't apply. You're still in it, still aware of it, still intending to reset. So it's not reversion, it's a pause. But here's what a pause that lasts 6 weeks actually is. It's a new standard. You just haven't updated the language yet. The gap between what you call it and what it is, that gap is doing a lot of the work right now. The gap is keeping the identity intact while the behavior runs a completely different policy underneath it. A man who is pausing is not the same man who has drifted, except when the pause is long enough. Then they're the same man. Relief became their standard. You just didn't announce it. Let's go back to the flight because here's a second part to that story. There's a second part to that story that matters. You landed, collected the bag. The meeting went well. The deal moved in the right direction. And in the car, the quiet after the performance, something came up. Not guilt, not failure, something quieter than that. More background, a low-level awareness, a signal. That plan I had for the morning, it's been a few days now, and you thought, next week. Not dramatically, just next week. Not because next week is structurally different, because next week is far enough away to feel like intention without requiring anything right now. That's the moment reversion completes. Not the exception, not the missed morning, not the flight, the decision in the quiet after the deal to make it a next week problem. And then the settling, the small relief that follows even that. The feeling that the situation is acknowledged and managed even though nothing has changed. You wouldn't run a business like this. Let me be direct about that. A performance gap that you can see, that you understand the mechanics of, that you've been intending to close for multiple quarters. You wouldn't tolerate that in any operation under your command. You'd isolate it, you'd make it explicit, you'd assign it to someone, you'd track variance, you'd review it, you'd close it. You wouldn't let it sit in the file labeled pending better conditions. But in here, you have been more patient with this than you are with anything else that matters to you. And the patience has shape now, a standard you articulate clearly, a behavior that runs a completely different policy. That gap between the stated standard and the operating standard, that's the audit result. And it's been widening, slowly, without drama. The same way the rest of this has been happening. What did the reversion actually cost you? not the training sessions, not the physical output. What standard did you lower in yourself? Not your results, not your professional performance, your own evidence about who you are. Because every time the loop runs, signal, pressure, exception, relief, recalibration, repeat, you produce a new data point. And the data point isn't, I had a hard week. The data point is, this is the place where I choose relief over standard. And you've been introducing that data point over long enough that it's no longer an isolated entry. It's a pattern, and patterns become identity. Not the identity you would claim, the one your behavior keeps building, whether you're watching it happen or not. I can still pull this back. That's what makes a loop so dangerous. It always leaves you feeling close enough to delay. Here's the uncomfortable question. One, and I'm asking it once. I'm only asking it once. When has the right moment ever arrived without you deciding it had? Not the quarter that finally settled, not the travel period that finally eased, not the week that finally had space in it. When has the window appeared on its own? Let that sit. Because the answer to that question is the answer to how long this continues. The moment doesn't arrive, the decision does, or it doesn't. Back to the flight, third time. You're in the air, pre-dawn, the deal's already in your head. I want you to locate the exact moment the plan dissolved. Not when you decided to skip it. You didn't decide. That's the point. It just became impractical. Became something that would happen later. Became background noise against everything else that was louder and closer even. That dissolution, that moment where the standard quietly stepped aside, that's where reversion lives. Not in the missed session, in the ease with which the standard moved. The standard you said was non-negotiable, moved without a fight, without a conversation, without you even fully registering it until you are already past it. That's the evidence, not what you missed, how easily it moved. A non-negotiable that negotiates isn't a standard. It's a preference with good branding. Let me repeat that. A non-negotiable that negotiates isn't a standard. It's a preference with good branding. You've told yourself this about finding the right structure, the right protocol, the right time of day, the right system for travel weeks. And maybe some of this is real, but here's what's also real. You have built more complex operating systems than this, with less clarity in less time. The issue was never the system. The issue is that the relief keeps outbidding the standard. And that's the part that should bother you. Because you don't lose to pressure. You're built for pressure. You're close and you're built for pressure. You close under pressure. Pressure is where you perform. You lose to the relief that comes after you explain the situation well enough to yourself. That's a fucking leak. Not the hard weeks, the soft moment after the hard week, when the explanation sounds good and the pressure drops and nothing actually changes. Reversion isn't failure. Let's be concise about that. Failure has drama. Failure has a moment. Reversion is quieter. It's a series of reasonable decisions that each make complete sense in isolation. And when you string them together across weeks, quarters, years, they form a policy. That's not an accident, a policy. A policy is relief when pressure gets high enough. And you've been running that policy long enough that it has compounding results. Not the kind you report to anyone, the kind that show up in the mirror, in the waistband, in the photograph you moved past without looking too long. You don't need to fall apart to drift. You just need to keep choosing relief at the precise moments where the standard is supposed to hold. Do that enough times, and the drift isn't something that happened to you. It's something you built carefully, quietly, one reasonable exception at a time. The week after the decision, the early flight, the first exception, the relief, the recalibration. You know the sequence now. You know it. You now know it because you've run it more than once, enough times that it has a groove. And the groove is a problem, not the individual moments, the groove. The question is not whether you can stop reverting. The question is whether you're going to keep calling it something cleaner than what it is. A choice, dressed as a circumstance, ratified quietly. Every time relief outranks the standard. And if relief keeps winning, stop calling this reversion. Call it policy. This is Iron Suits. The mirror doesn't argue, it reports. Send this to a man who needs to hear it. Subscribe. New episode coming soon.